Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, a focus on Africa. First, Mozambique, where the bond markets have sent out a massive distress signal. We'll take a look at how the Southeast African nation has got its finances in such a tangle and whether the much-touted natural gas dollars will ever materialise. And then we cross the border into South Africa, where the budget's done little to calm tensions with students and has forecast even slower growth for this year. Is there any sort of recovery in sight for what was once Africa's undeniable powerhouse? Plus, a free trade pact between the European Union and Canada has been agreed, but not without a fight. We'll look at how the tiny state of Wallonia nearly tripped up the transatlantic deal. So we're starting this week with one of those countries you don't hear much about, which is exactly why we want to talk about it. Mozambique, Africa's 19th largest economy last year, so not bad, but still well below the continent's main players. If you're not familiar with it, here it is on the map. It is down on the southeastern coast of the continent, just to the north of South Africa, with the city of Maputo as its capital. Now, the discovery of gas fields off the Mozambique coast in 2011 was meant to transform the economy, but that still remains years away. And then this past week, Mozambique was forced to make an admission. The Ministry of Finance said its debt is now more than double its GDP and that talks with creditors must take place in order to restructure that mountain of debt. So what's gone wrong? How is a country which actually saw massive improvements in its economy since the end of its civil war back in 1992 now landed up with potentially uncontrollable debts? Well, a lot of it is down to a rather fishy story, the so-called tuna bond. This is what happened. Back in 2013, Mozambique needed money to buy a tuna fishing fleet. So a government-backed investment vehicle was created. It issued debt on the international credit markets. So far, so good. Now, investors were keen, but the proceeds of that bond ended up going to buy defence systems, not tuna boats. The scandal meant Mozambique had to restructure the loans as government debt. And then the International Monetary Fund said it had uncovered secret loans and it suspended aid altogether, pending further investigation. The tuna bond saga is a cautionary tale indeed when it comes to emerging market debt. In other words, chasing the strong yields is risky. The role of the banks is interesting too. They originally packaged up the tuna bond and sold it off as a bet on Mozambique's potential gas wealth. Well, let's talk Mozambique with Peter Montalto. He's an executive director at Nomura International Bank, specialising in European, African and Middle East emerging markets. Peter, it looks like Mozambique has got some fairly serious debt problems to deal with. Can you explain it a little more to our viewers in the simple terms and what the impact might be if it gets itself into further trouble?
Well, the problem Mozambique basically has is that it has sort of this huge volume of gas exports that are sort of looming out there on the horizon that's going to help the budget, that is going to help growth. They're only going to come on stream really 2 to 3 years down the line when the gas fields are fully developed, when, for instance, a new pipeline may be built to South Africa to deal with gas demand from there as well, and exports pick up. But in the short term, what it has is a huge debt overhang, about 125% of GDP of debt, very high debt service costs as well, oscillating in the coming years between sort of 20 and 40% of GDP, massive strain on the budget from that. And basically it has this gap, if you like, of a lack of growth and a lack of fiscal revenues to pay for that debt in the short run before those sort of gas revenues come on in the medium run. That's why now they're talking about an IMF bailout and talking about restructuring debt as well. The problem they have is that they have hidden debt, it seems, or debt's been forgotten about by the government and is now having to be fully audited by the IMF to see actually what debt the country does have. And that's going to make the process of restructuring the debt and reducing those debt service costs very difficult before that actually happens.
From what you can see, Peter, and without being either overly simplistic or indeed overly alarmist about the whole thing, is there actually potential for Mozambique to default here?
Well, the government's trying to avoid a default by restructuring and basically asking investors to sort of give them time, saying here are all these revenues, I said, on the horizon from gas, and from restructuring of the economy that's going on. Can you give us a payment moratorium of, say, 2-3 years? Maybe then issue new debt to replace existing debt that's linked to, say, those gas revenues or to the uptick in GDP. GDP-related contracts have been used elsewhere in Greece and restructurings like that. And that's probably what they're going to be going to bondholders and asking for. But I said the process is going to be quite complicated given the lack of IMF backstop at the moment and the lack of certainty on what is going on around the level of debt. But I think ultimately investors will agree. It's just a question of timing. It might be a quite complicated sort of 6-month process or even longer for this to actually happen. But there will be some restructuring of debt. But if they allow it too long, then they may miss payments, and that would then be a technical default.
All right, Peter, just stay there for me for a moment because we're going to talk about South Africa too, but I just want to bring our viewers up to speed there first. South Africa, low growth, political turmoil, months of violent student protests. And now Finance Minister Pravin Gordhan's cut the country's growth forecast down to just 0.5%. The one bright spot, though, is an increase in subsidies for South Africa's poorest students to attend university. But still, the government's under huge pressure to entirely fund higher education. More with our guest, Peter Montalto, after this from Harumutasa in Cape Town.
University students say it's their democratic right to protest outside Parliament in Cape Town. They were hoping to get answers from South Africa's Finance Minister on how the government plans to pay for free education for students from poor and working class families. But riot police made them disperse.
The police kept telling protesting students to disperse, leave the Parliament area. Students wouldn't listen. They're now running battles in the streets. Police are running after the students throughout the CBD in Cape Town, the city centre. They're ordering people off the streets, trying to tell the students to get out the way. It seems now students are scattered in the different alleyways of the street. All those gunfire sounds and stun grenades as police try frantically to disperse students and arrest those who are causing problems.
Some people were injured, others were chased downtown. These students want to go to university for free, a right they say the ANC-led government promised the poor black majority when apartheid ended.
It's very disappointing that the youth of 1976 fought for education, and now we still have to fight and we still have to be shot at. This is not on.
The finance minister met some of the protesting students. He says additional funding has been allocated to fund higher education.
So all I'm saying to you, hand over your, I can read the memorandum myself.
All right.
Your comrade has already articulated the key demands.
Okay.
We are aware of them.
Nearly 1 million students enrolled at South African universities last year. Government officials say that's too many, and state-run institutions can only cope with about 600,000. Resources are stretched, and not everyone can get government grants. But South African students have warned the government they will shut down universities across the country if their demands aren't met.
Peter, we've talked a lot about South Africa on this program in the past, about its strength as one of the BRICS nations, but then also about how it was once overtaken by Nigeria to become Africa's biggest economy. And now it's starting to feel like things are sliding even further. As a very general question, and this is very general, but what, in your opinion, has gone wrong with South Africa?
Well, that's a really interesting, very complicated question around the sort of history of South African government's intervention into the economy, having too much of an interventionist policy, which seems to have stifled FDI in particular. There's been now more FDI flowing out of the country from South African corporates investing abroad as opposed to foreign companies investing in South Africa. And you've added on top of that political uncertainty, regulatory uncertainty, legislative uncertainty that the government has now created. And that's dragged back growth from sort of pre-crisis averages above 4%, back now down to probably in the medium run at best 2% odd. And that's really creating a lot of problems for the budget this week, as well as for job creation and development more generally.
And as far as the actual economy goes, the things which drive it, I guess we're talking about mining and the like, is this a problem at the moment? Is this a problem as to why things have slowed down so much?
Well, it's a kind of semi-misconception, if you like, that South Africa is a mining economy in the sense that it's been a declining share of GDP output for the last 60 years, declining share in jobs as well. It's now only making up at around 8% of the volume of output of the economy, which is very, very small versus, say, 20% 10 years ago. So it's declined a lot as a result of problems in the labour market, very high wage increases offered to workers because of unionisation in South Africa, and naturally very high costs as well. Has the world's deepest gold mines, for instance, are in South Africa. And you add on top of that some of the crises that have happened in the mining sector, like the Marikana tragedy, where 43 miners got killed by police in 2012, a very long strike in 2014. These have really held the industry back. Where the industries that are doing well in South Africa are ones that are less reliant on unionised labour, less reliant on government regulation, particularly service sector, banking, lawyers, consultants, all those sorts of people are doing very well. But that doesn't really help your sort of semi-skilled blue-collar workers, who are the ones who are most in need of jobs.
So how does South Africa expand again? Where can it find? Well, OK, actually, there's two things here. One is going to be the austerity in the short term that is probably going to be a problem, as it has been in many other countries that have gone down the austerity path. But beyond that, where does it find the growth? How does it create jobs? If you're saying mining's in decline, where are the jobs going to come from?
So the problem, I think, with the budget we saw this week was that there is a degree of austerity, but not that much. They're not really pushing the brake fully to the floor, if you like, at the moment on expenditure. They're simply curtailing and slowing the pace of growth and having to make a lot of room for extra expenditure, actually, on things like higher education, given the fees must fall violent protests against against tuition fee hikes at universities that we're now seeing. But really the growth drivers in the medium run have to come from new economies, particularly around renewable energies, which South Africa has very successfully done, but has been sort of stymied a little bit in the short term by some uncertainty around regulation on that front, and the role of the monopoly energy buyer, which is Eskom, the state-owned electricity company. So there are certainly a lot of opportunities there. As I said, there are opportunities in these service sectors which are helping. Retail as well is doing quite well, given a moderately fast expanding population, about 1.7% a year. The population is growing, which is helping the retail sector. But the really sort of difficult jobs and all the widespread jobs that are needed in manufacturing especially are where there's going to be a challenge, and where we need to see a greater policy certainty, greater economic leadership from government to take some difficult decisions on labour market reforms, on things like that, which are going to come in the long run, but it's quite difficult in this very contested political environment to see where that will happen in the short run.
Peter Montalto there with the word on South Africa and on Mozambique before that. Peter, thank you. And still ahead on Counting the Cost, we'll break down some significant mega mergers agreed this past week and tell you how they might shape the future of our technological world. That is still to come. Before that, though, we're off to Europe, where a free trade deal between the European Union and Canada was finally hammered out. It was 7 years in the making, but nearly came undone in just a few days, and all because of the little-known French-speaking region of Belgium called Wallonia, which didn't like the effect the deal would have on its agriculture sector and so blocked the approval from the Belgian Parliament. In the end, though, political leaders reached a consensus in support of the EU-Canada trade deal known as CETA. Once the deal is signed, almost all tariffs between Canada and the EU will be eliminated. Supporters say CETA will boost transatlantic trade and small businesses. Critics, though, say it'll weaken health environmental standards. Duncan Golestani has our report.
The Belgian Prime Minister was supposed to meet his Canadian counterpart on Thursday to sign a major trade deal. Instead, he's been negotiating with other Belgian politicians before finally consensus.
This committee just reached an agreement on the text that defined the Belgian proposal and that it is immediately addressed to the EU and the President of the EU Council.
The agreement satisfies the concerns of Belgium's regions, in particular how disputes will be resolved. Elsewhere in Brussels, the announcement that CETA is closer to being ratified angered protesters who are vowing to fight on.
There's still much to play for. The deal that's been done here in Belgium is still going to have to be approved on Friday by the multiple Belgian parliaments. And people here in Belgium, as well as across Europe, have shown that they're not for these sorts of trade deals which can undermine our health, our food safety and our rights to regulate.
The fears of Belgian farmers were part of the reason the Wallon region blocked the federal government from approving the EU trade deal. many believing it does more for big business than anyone else.
They may well be happy inside the European Commission that this embarrassing delay is finally over, but there is a much bigger question to consider. That is, how does this vast union of 28 member states act with one voice on trade while also listening to citizens?
It was under pressure from member states that the EU decided to allow them a say in the trade deal by making it a so-called mixed agreement. One politician has said it's an historic mistake. Those who know how Brussels works warn of further trouble ahead as the EU negotiates an even bigger transatlantic trade deal with the United States.
Yes, there is a precedent, and now that the democratic Pandora box has been opened, it will be very difficult to just close it again.
For now, the political focus is getting CETA passed. The new wording of the agreement is being sent to the other 27 member states for approval. Then finally, it will be ready to sign with Canada.
Well, let's go to Strasbourg now to speak to a member of the European Parliament, Siegfried Morrison, who is an MEP, also spokesperson for the European People's Party. Siegfried, it seems there is never a dull moment in the EU these days. But this situation, it is quite extraordinary that one small region of one small country could almost upset an entire deal like this.
Yes, you're absolutely right. We have been negotiating this trade deal between the European Union and Canada for 7 years now. We reached an agreement on the substance, and it was in summer of this year when we decided to allow parliaments of member states of the European Union to have a say about this. We would not have needed to do this from European level, so we could have considered it as a EU, as a European level only trade agreement and ratify it only in the European Parliament, where there exists a clear majority in favor of it, and by the so-called Council of Ministers at European level, the place where all 28 governments are being represented. But we said in order not to lose people and in order to reduce the resistance and the concerns of the people, we are also going to allow for national parliaments to ratify it.
What you've just described to me, taking it to individual government level, that is simply putting democracy into practice, isn't it? And that's what the EU and all these other countries are supposed to be all about. So what happened was a result of a democracy which you invoked. You've got to salvage it yourselves.
Absolutely. So firstly, the deal is good. It's good for Canada, it's good for the EU, and it's the most modern trade deal which the EU has ever negotiated. It enables growth. And as you know, trade is of course a prerequisite for more growth. It lifts many people out of poverty. So this trade deal is good, and it would also lead to more growth and more jobs on both sides of the Atlantic, by the way. People in Wallonia, they have specific concerns linked to agriculture, linked to environment, which are areas where we are safeguarding European standards, European consumer protection, European environment standards. But you also have to know that Wallonia is a province of heavy industry, coal mining, steel industry, which has suffered over the course of the past decades with many of these industries simply moving away from Europe. But the truth is that through trade, trade is of course a key growth engine in Europe. We are exporting a lot, which means that through more trade, more jobs are being secured here.
So when we speak to that issue of credibility, it of course raises questions about the next big deal which the European Union has to negotiate. That is of course the Brexit. Now, in this case of the CETA deal, Canada was saying, hey look, we're ready to sign this thing, whenever you are. So it's not the other side which was the problem here. There seems to be an issue within the EU, and that won't give people confidence as we go into the Brexit negotiations.
So you've said many important things. So one by one, on CETA, it's not the European level which failed. It's not even the national level. It's a regional level. But people outside Europe, they won't care about this. They want Europe to be reliable. But one has to know that this is the way in which Europe works. And with 28 member states, with various interests, we are always getting to the point. But sometimes it just takes us 2-3 iterations, more talks than we would all want to get to a point. So Europe will remain a trustworthy partner, but this is simply the way in which we work. We don't have a president as the United States have, with an administration who is so much streamlined as in the United States. So this is the way Europe works. People have to get used to it, and it won't be different. When it comes to Brexit, of course, what was good, I think the single most important event which happened between the closing of the polling stations in Britain and now was the decision of the former Prime Minister Cameron not to trigger that famous Article 50, so starting negotiations immediately, because that would have put us all under tremendous pressure, and that would also have led to significant insecurity with the markets. We are now at the point at which Prime Minister May said, I'm going to start talks in March of next year. We are saying we're not talking because before you formally trigger the process, so we are going to start in March of next year. I'm sure both the British and the European side will be well prepared. We have already set up our negotiation team, and then we have 2 years for talks. I think it's in the best interest of both sides that at the end of the day we have a close relationship, especially in economic terms. The single market has served both Britain and the EU well, so I think it's in Britain's interest that they still remain part of the single market, for which of course they would need to make some political concessions. I was in Washington 2 weeks ago, and everyone there, bankers, central bankers, large investors, they said Britain should do whatever it takes to keep close economic ties with Europe.
Siegfried Morrison, pleasure to talk to you again on Counting the Cost. Thank you for joining us. We want to bring your attention now to some other big deals agreed this past week, starting off with the largest deal in the history of the semiconductor industry. And yes, I know you're probably wondering why we should care about that, but semiconductors actually have a big impact on society and our daily lives. You'll find them at the heart of most electrical devices. And so now we have Qualcomm, which makes the electronic chips that run most of the world's smartphones, buying up a company called NXP in a $47 billion deal. Now, NXP has a big presence in the car industry, so it seems the two firms want to be a big player in that market for connected cars and the Internet of Things devices, two things which we've actually looked at quite a bit recently on Counting the Cost. But when it came to companies, it wasn't even the biggest deal this week. That honour goes to AT&T, which announced it's buying Time Warner for $85 billion. Victoria Gatenby has more on that.
AT&T provides wireless and internet services to millions of people in the United States. What it doesn't own is content, the programs its customers watch on their phones or TVs. This deal could change that.
If their secrets get too big, killing it may be the cost of doing business.
It would give AT&T control of the Warner Brothers film studio. It produced Ben Affleck's new film, The Accountant, which has topped the US box office. It would also give it control of TV channels HBO and CNN. The proposed deal is part of a trend. 5 years ago, telecoms giant Comcast and NBC Universal merged. And last year, AT&T bought DirecTV, creating the largest pay-TV company in the United States. The AT&T Time Warner deal will need approval from regulators, which could take more than a year. One issue they'll consider is whether the merger would reduce competition, leading to higher prices and fewer choices for consumers. Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump says he'll block the deal if elected.
As an example of the power structure I'm fighting, AT&T is buying Time Warner and thus CNN, a deal we will not approve in my administration because it's too much concentration of power in the hands of too few.
Members of the Senate say the deal raises questions about the consolidation of the media market in the United States. They want more information about how it will affect consumers.
And finally, just a quick mention on social media giant Twitter, because its third quarter earnings were interesting for a number of reasons. First, it got up at 4 in the morning to report them, trying to get a jump on the markets. And then it announced a major restructuring of its business. It's cutting 9% of its global workforce, about 350 jobs, and it's killing off its video service, Vine, the one where you could use your creativity to make 6-second video loops. Remember something here, Twitter's never reported a profit, and it's struggling to grow its user base to the size of some of its rivals. For example, Facebook has over 1.5 billion monthly active users. Twitter, just around 317 million. There's also been lots of speculation surrounding a potential takeover, but no buyers have actually emerged so far. And on that note, that is our show for this week. More for you online, though, at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page. with individual reports, links and entire episodes for you to catch up on. You can also get in touch with us. Hop on Twitter, for example. Tweet me at KamalAJE. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or just drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria. From the whole team, thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.